welcome to today's breakaway session. For those who don't know me, my name is Lihle Ngobozi, and I'm a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. I must apologize for not having my camera on. There is load shedding in South Africa at the moment, which means there's no electricity. And so if I put my video on, there'll be quite a considerable amount of lag, so you won't be able to hear me quite clearly. So please do accept my apologies for that. So today we have a very exciting conversation that we'll be having, following on from the sessions that we've had throughout the course of the day. We will have a very exciting lineup of speakers who will really be talking about women and building a feminist Pan-African future. We have a number of speakers, like I've already said, who are all incredibly insightful and also will be able to share their knowledge within this particular subject area. Please also be mindful that you are more than welcome to make use of the chat section where you can make your comments, drop some questions for our panelists, as well as any other questions that you might have had throughout the different the session before this. So please do make sure that you make use of that, and I will flag those questions or comments and follow them through to our panelists this afternoon. And so without wasting further time, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Darlene Miller. Dr. Darlene Miller is a senior lecturer at WSG, which is the Wits School of Governance. She completed a doctorate study in sociology at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the US, with a focus on regional political economy. In her activist days, she was the National Education Coordinator of Sakau, a COSATU retail trade union. She was also the director of the Institute of African Alternatives South Africa, a research and training institute with chapters in London and across Africa. Her recent work includes film documentaries on women's leadership, as well as project management of research on large-scale land acquisitions in Southern Africa. She was the Bloomberg Africa Fellow at Human Rights Watch in New York in the year of 9/11, and senior advisor to the CEO of the Human Sciences Research Council for the International Social Science Council, Paris. Her current research interests are feminist critiques of patriarchal accumulation in Southern Africa, women in leadership, and food governance. So we are more than lucky to have Dr. Miller with us today, and I'm sure she'll be able to share her wealth of knowledge with us. So Dr. Miller, over to you. Dr. Miller, are you with us? Sure. All right. It seems Dr. Miller has probably run into some technical issues. I think we can go forward with our next speaker. And please do excuse me if I don't pronounce your surname correctly, Reverend. Please feel free to correct me. Our second speaker is Reverend Dion P. Bossier, if I'm not mistaken. Again, please do correct me. She is an experienced chaplain with a demonstrated history of working in the religious institutions industry, skilled in nonprofit organizations, coaching, pastoral counseling, conflict resolution, fund development, theological education, advocacy training, and event management. She has a strong community and social services professional with a Master's of Divinity focused in theological seminary from Union Theological Seminary. So Reverend, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon. Greetings to all who are gathered here. We had a bit of a tragedy here this morning, and so forgive me if my thoughts are a little bit disjointed. It is such an honor to be here and among you and on this panel of building a feminist Pan-African future. It is an honor and indeed a privilege to be here amongst you. And again, so grateful for Dr. Walker Smith, Reverend Chikani, all the co-conveners of this entire conference, and for those who are on the panel this morning. And so in African spirit, I give honor to my elders, mentors, teachers, mothers, and grandmothers, and those sisters and beloved siblings among us. I honor the griots and the storytelling that we are here to do, and the sisters in the movement, those who have paved the way in order for us to be here. And so to that I say ashe. When we're thinking about what it means for me to paint the picture of what a Pan-African future must look like, I wanted to just this mode of building on a feminist Pan-African future. I wanted to say one thing from the poet and playwright who has put together in 1983, Alice Walker is who I'm speaking of, a Black feminist who was a poet and an author and activist who coined the term womanist. In that prose, the prose with the name of In Search of My Mother's Gardens, a womanist prose, within the definition, it says, lavender, purple is to lavender as womanist is to feminist is to womanist. And so I want to offer that as sort of the starting point of my comments this morning, because as a transnationalist, one who has her feet grounded here in the US, but who I identify, of course, because my family and my nationalism is within the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago in particular. And so I embrace a womanist theological lens. And I'm saying this as the first woman of African descent to hold the position where I am here at the Church Center for the United Nations, which of course we exist to expand this the ecumenical community's capacity and access to the UN, and to bring a greater voice morally and ethically around the concerns of the church, peacemaking and advocacy. In order to do that, one must be one's authentic self. Yes, and so what I'm saying in terms of building on that is I have found that there has not been space for Black women in particular in the spaces that have been labeled and identified as feminist. And so when we're speaking of the feminist agenda, for me, my challenge has been there has not been space that I have seen for those of us who identify as Black women. The challenges have been mostly this agenda, the feminist agenda, ideally and theologically as well as ethically, has been coined and termed for white women who are striving to find equality with white men. And so this has been historically the way. I'm saying from African and African diasporic people, for me, creating a space for Black feminists and ones who identify as womanists as myself, even mujerista theologians, those who are Latinx and our Native and Indigenous women do not often find space for one who identifies just as feminist. And so in creating a future that we are all included in, my hope is that we can create that space for us who have been otherwise erased from our own labor for the mainstream feminist movement, as I said, which often centers whiteness, particularly white heterosexual women seeking to be equal with white heterosexual men. The other thing within the definition that I mentioned of Alice Walker's definition of womanist in her womanist prose is what I'm saying. I think that we all need to consider also And here is a quote directly from it. It says, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female, not a separatist except periodically for health. Traditionally a universalist, as in, quote, Mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow, and our cousins are white, beige, and black? And the answer, well, you know, the colored race is just like a flower garden with every color flower represented. End quote. Traditionally capable, as in, Mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you as a bunch of other slaves and other slaves with me. Reply, it wouldn't be the first time. And so we cannot achieve, this is the end of that quote, we cannot achieve a wholeness of an entire people, or even the interconnectedness that we have heard being talked about throughout the week, right, as has been mentioned before. And the stories, if the stories of African and Africans in the diaspora are not centered, and that if we are not included within this, the feminist dialogue, right? So my hope is that we can do more that we have to understand that the fight for liberation for Africans and Africans of the diaspora, and if we are to create a future where all are welcome, that we cannot exist if not only our stories are centered, but unless all of our lives are included valuably and all of our stories are included valuably. So that's all Black lives. I want to, as I am coming to my close, I know we only have 10 minutes and there's more on the panel. I want to also offer to say that within my context as a Caribbean American, I have not, it has not been, it's not been void within the history of the Caribbean to see Black women leading and Black women as center, right? As Prime Minister, we saw, I mean, of course, our very first in Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister, Kamala Prasad-Bissar, and of course, Paula Mae Weeks, who is the first female president of Trinidad and Tobago. And so we see within the political realm that we have leadership, Black women, and I don't say that they would identify as womanist, but when we assume a feminist agenda only, where we are not naming Black feminists or naming womanists, those or mujerista theologians, and those of us who are of other ethnic diasporas, and of course of the diaspora, then I feel like we are losing out of the beauty of the mosaic that we are as a people. And so there are other names for which I find me doing my work from, right, where there were mothers of the movement that came and were inspired by Alice Walker's womanist prose, who became, and that were theologians and ethicists, and active within the faith communities as I am, that were the impetus for me to find my own voice and to tell my own story. And these were now an ancestors, Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. These were Dr. Dolores Williams, and we're talking about Dr. Jacqueline Grant, who were the mothers of this womanist movement here in the US, theological movement that were inspired by Alice Walker's prose. And so I find that we must do the same. There are others that are leading so many, and I don't have the time to name them all, but I mentioned one before, and I will mention her again because she offers a sort of paradigm for us to continue to use, Dr. Stacey Floyd Thomas, with her work and the four-part definition that is in Walker's definition of womanist. She uses, Floyd Thomas does, the tenets of womanist ethics, and she uses them as radical subjectivity, traditional communalism, redemptive self-love, and critical engagement. What I am saying essentially is that we are not only centering our own stories as womanist and Black feminists, but we are including the entire community. We cannot do anything on our own or by ourselves. And when one succeeds, our entire community succeeds. And so traditionally feminists have have lifted just women's voices, as I said, centering whiteness, and we must center ourselves, our own stories, the stories of the Africans and the African diasporas, celebrating all of our lives, those within the Black Lives Matter movements, and those who are embracing these sort of 4-point tenets with embracing this womanist theological lens, in addition to this feminist agenda. And this, for me, is how we can continue our advocacy, continue to partner with one another, and to create a future where we are all welcome. So I'll stop there. Blessings.
Thank you so much, Reverend, for that insightful contribution. I think you raised quite critical points around, the discourse around feminism and whether it is, an all-encompassing identity politic or an all-encompassing movement that incorporates not just only the white cis heterosexual woman, but is able to encompass, the experience and the lived realities of Black women. But I also think the contentious point as well, when you're thinking about feminism or womanism, whichever Black feminist approach you want to look at it, is if we're looking specifically within diaspora, we also need to take into account the different power relations that come into play within the diaspora as well. And how then a lot of Black feminist discourse, specifically from the North Americas, has a way of, in and of itself, being quite totalizing in its approach. And most of the time, a lot of African scholarship around feminist futures, or even thinking about what Pan-African feminist scholarship looks like, or Pan-African feminist movement organizing looks like, most of the time it's subsumed under, the African-American feminist agenda, which is not entirely wrong. But I think that if we're wanting to have a more equitable understanding of different feminist standpoints across the diaspora, we really also need to take into consideration the different contextual analysis and the different contextual terrains that a lot of people in the diaspora come from, and we don't all come to the Black feminist agenda from the same contextual vantage point. And so I think a complication of that as well would be quite interesting, but I think we can leave that for the question and answer session shortly, and probably you could elaborate on that once you have a chance.
I'd like that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. We also have Dr. Darlene Miller, which I introduced earlier, who will be making her contribution as well. So Dr. Miller, you can go for it.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon to our panelists as well. Sorry, we don't have the opportunity to meet each other in person. Okay, so we have some translations here, don't we, Lishle?
Yes, we do.
Currently, okay.
I've noted that.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask that our translators don't be burdened with trying to translate the first three transparencies that I present, because it's poetic writing, so it's not going to make sense and it's going to take too long. So please bear with us. We can circulate that little small PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll go slower for the other parts to accommodate the translation. We can translate the title of the paper. So if I can just share my screen. Okay, so you can see the story is telling me, sorry, there's a little bit of noise outside the window, so let me just ask them to be quiet. Hello, hi. The noise is carrying. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so the story is telling me our ancestral rivers, matrilineage and lineages of freedom. The story is telling me our ancestral rivers, matrilineage and lineages of freedom. And I'll begin with a little statement which says, onder decoy. I'm a colored woman from the Cape, and we bring you color. This is what we bring. I was not dragged out from under the bed, under the Khoi, to dance and sing for white people. I'm descended of Khoi grandmothers and the Indian South Asian servant classes. Once again, the patriarchs come to claim my body, this time the Khoi patriarchs. But I'm a matriarch. I belong to the earth and the heavens. My body is not here for the claiming by any patriarch, Khoi or other. I'm a colored woman from the Cape, and I bring you color. This is what I bring. And I share with you a little stereotype of a poem written by Bunzaya, which was oft recited in the 19th century, a typical stereotype of the colored woman. It's Afrikaans, and I'll translate it into English. My name is Kykie Kekkelbeck. I kom van Katrivier. There is van water geen gebrek, maar skes van wyn en bier. Mijn ABC at Phillips School, I learnt een kleine bikkie and left with wisdom just as full as gekke Tanti Meiki. If I come from the Katrivier, there's not a shortage of water, but there's a shortage of wine and beer. I learned my ABCs at Phillips School. I only learned a little bit. I left with wisdom just as much as crazy Auntie Mechi. So Don Matera, the famous South African writer, in his book called Gone with the Twilight, 1987, he says, Busmans and Hotnots, the derogatory names they gave to the coloreds. Coloreds are a nation unto themselves, assert the Boer geneticists, a nation with its own culture, its own civilization, and its own destiny. A doctrine many coloreds believe and perpetuate in their homes and schools and churches and in every walk of their lives. A coloredness bloated by a false sense of nationhood, almost white but not black, not African despite the genetic throwbacks. Many of them supporting the racial theories of the Boers formed coloreds-only political parties and openly campaigned for nationhood under the apartheid policy. So the end of apartheid opened the path for elite transition, in which a small minority of Black South Africans could become a part of the accumulating classes. In this talk, I would like to turn our attention to the experiences of a minority people in South Africa. Colored women of Khoi descent. Khoi is one of the linguistic social groups in Southern Africa, in South and Southern Africa. Why bother with yet another little indigenous group, some might ask? The universal African implication from our experiences derives from our spiritual and indigenous conclusions about African reconnection. So the universal implication that I'm drawing from our place in the world, from our experiences, derives from our spiritual and indigenous conclusions about African reconnection. So I'm counterposing disposition and reconnection that may hold some value for others, whether you're an urban cosmopolitan or an Afrofuturist who loves Wakanda. So I'll be talking to 3 conference themes: 1, decolonizing knowledge; 2, Black Lives Matter; and 3, Pan-Africanism and African spirituality, and how we, as indigenes of Khoi descent, can add to liberating spiritualities. There's not much I can share in such a small period, but I'll try to flag some of the key ideas, and hopefully soon there will be written products where people can pursue the ideas in a more systematic way. So firstly, addressing the problem of aborted legacies. I'm currently undertaking research that I hope will help to shed more light on colored lineage, particularly through autoethnography and through a reappraisal of the lineage and experiences of the woman referred to as the first matriarch of the Cape, Kritoa. She was a Khoi translator and mediator for the Dutch in the 1650s when they began their colonial conquest of the Cape. The Khoi were one group amongst many Black indigenes who inhabited the southern part of Africa. Kretoa, a lesser known figure, was in the lineages of freedom in South Africa. She is a lesser known figure, but she was a powerful and beautiful woman whose history was lost by time and colonialism, like so many African women. And both her memory and her lineage form part of the historical loss and invisibilization of many remarkable and memorable African women from this part of the continent. So I argue that the loss of this lineage and those of other Khoi or colored women is a situation that affects many South Africans classified as colored, and that this loss of lineage has all kinds of implications for colored women and our ability to contribute to a Pan-Africanist project. Many colored women have Khoi ancestry, and I want to briefly reflect on these unique experiences. Because the truth to me, one of the many truths we have, is that the past is a gift. It is an ancestral river that in our case has been eviscerated and destroyed by the historic actions of others. And this is an important reality. When one does not have this written or verbal record of one's lineage, when you go to the archives and you are repeatedly frustrated as you find that your microfilms are removed, consciously removed, so that your dirty little secret is not exposed. When you don't have these written or verbal records of one's lineage, this link to the land through their past, then one loses out on the spiritual and symbolic connections to the past. Many African Black South Africans still have some active connection to the land. Many can trace back to their ancestral homes and lineages. However, being a colored indigene and descendant of the Khoi means to exist with a very thorough, a very complete dispossession. Mixed race parentage with fragmented histories on either side. While many of us do not know our lineage, this is a universal experience for people who are classified as colored. And these fragmented pasts have debilitating consequences for the people who inhabit these identities. They create a poor sense of belonging, a lack of vision of a collective future, an impoverished connection with the past. So how is it possible to contribute to a collective vision of Africa's future when you are lost in the murky waters of a most messy identity? And this is a very universal experience for women classified or perceived as colored. Like Kretoa, we arrive into spaces that a combination of hard work, intrepid spirits, and very ambivalent and confused identities bequeath us. So there's a universal type of person that does not fit. And given how so many post-colonial systems in Africa are patriarchal, this gives rise to a special kind of marginalization for Khoi colored women. So I use the body of Kretoa to tell the story of a particularly gifted young woman who enters the house as a maid at the age of 11, the first regent, the Van Riebeeck. And she spends 10 years with that family. But during that brief period of her life, She mediates wars between the Khoi, the local people, and the Dutch. She is a mediator and translator and emissary between the various groups within the Khoi. They were, of course, heterogeneous, and the Dutch East India Company. So this instrument of colonization and these local peoples, this little young woman, she's a small, frail, not frail, but she was hardy, but this tiny little woman plays this pivotal role. His royal lineage, and she takes over from her uncle and the men at that time who were the interlocutors. And as with her uncle and the other male interlocutors, her loyalty is doubted on either side of the divide. So I can't go much more into her history except to say that she was the first, reportedly the first biracial marriage in the Cape, the area just in the southernmost point of Africa. It straddles the two current regions in that historical period of the 17th century. And she marries this Dutch engineer. And at first, she's the darling of the Dutch because she has this backing. She's the trusted inside laborer, inside worker of this colonial family. But she also is able to hold sufficient respect with these Khoi groups. Can you imagine doing that at the age of 16? Playing that kind of political and economic role as an emissary. But yet she dies in her early 30s as a very broken and dejected figure, a very, very tragic figure. And there's much to be learned from Kritoa, sometimes colonially known as Efa of the Cape, the first matriarch, because she embodies an African universal, possibly a global universal. So to make the point about the importance of finding our ancestral rivers, many people know their lineage and the source and trajectories of these ancestral rivers. For those of us who lack these lineages, there is a deep spiritual importance to finding and reconnecting with one's ancestral rivers. Jackie Koch has written, the South African feminist, written a book on writing the ancestral river. But her vantage point is as a white South African. Her own ambivalence is that as a radical environmentalist, her grandfather was one of the big developmental engineers who was spearheading the subjection of our natural resources to ports and rivers that could be navigated for the purposes of maritime trade. But so she watches these Xhosa people in the river as they are performing these rites, but she has no lens through which to interpret the spiritual rituals of these African people. And I use this example to stress for us the importance of writing our own ancestral stories. As the indigenes of the Cape, as the indigenes of Southern Africa, we cannot continue to have our stories framed within the lens of colonial and Eurocentric knowledge. So writing our stories becomes then an important part of the decolonizing of knowledge. And as the offspring of indigenous peoples, we stand inside of the river, looking outwards at the political economic structures of ownership and the white claimants who establish themselves with written words and written documents, with written archives and with legal language, particularly the conjured up title deeds. And so given the evisceration of our history, given the evisceration of our archives for so many of us, together with Nomalanga Mkhize, who first coined this term umbilical ontology, well, not together with, but she coined the term, and I've tried to explore this idea of what could an umbilical ontology be, because it came up as a seminar idea. And somehow I would argue that we can trace our lineage using the umbilical cord as a metaphor to cycle back into the fragments of our past, but also an idea that I can't expand on now. To reflect on the many, clearly Kritoa was someone who also suffered a lot in relation to her children. Her body is a reproductive human, as a human being that could produce as a woman with the capacity to birth. She had miscarriages, suspected abortions. There was a very tricky and difficult lineage that she experienced. And so abortion, I argue in this paper, is a metaphor for our aborted lineage. And just then to conclude, I then say that messy authenticity is the part where we are grounded, rooted, viscerally part of nature. The dispossessed condition for those who leave their home bases and move into different spaces in work, country, organization, have the arduous climb into assimilation and complexity. So the dispossessed condition for those who leave their home bases and move into different spaces in work, country, organization, have the arduous climb into assimilation and complexity. If some version of an authentic identity does not emerge out of this journey and we succumb to assimilation, and here you can see I'm trying to hint at a more generalizable argument, the outcome may be an aborted life, a life of lost lineage, an abortion of future lineage, an abortion of past Indigenous identities. In short, an impoverished life. And I advocate earth reconnection as part of the spiritual reconnection. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention. And thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Miller, for that insightful presentation. I think the point that you make on this idea of lineages, and not just physical ancestral lineages, but also thinking through the lineage of knowledge production that is not just only located within, walls of academia or the walls of, social theorizing, but also within the physical embodiment of our lineages, and how those are also part and parcel of the framing of feminist futures, specifically from a Pan-African perspective. And so being able to locate ourselves ancestrally, not just within, geographically, but also within the line of knowledge production is actually quite critical, a critical contribution to the conversation. I note that we only have 5 minutes left, and I know that Dr. Angelique wanted to speak to the Pan-African Women's Conference that was held last week, Saturday. So I think we could just give her a chance to do so. And if we have more time, then we can just field a few comments from the comment section. Dr. Angelique?
Yes, thank you so much. And I want to thank the other speakers for their very important sharings today. They're very important. Just to say that there was a Pan-African Women's Ecumenical Empowerment Network and Pan-African Women of Faith conference on last week, on Saturday, and that it would be important to have that in mind even as we go forward relative to the conferencing. It is important to point out, as was pointed out last Saturday, that we did tell her stories, exploring women's engagement before and at Manchester, Tanzania, and beyond. Contrary to popular notions, there were women in 1900. There were women all the way through all of the Pan-African Congresses. And it's very important that we observe that as we rewrite the narrative and speak of women's stories, her stories, which is what we sought to do last Saturday. It is important to point out again, that there were certain names that were part of that. 6 women who were there as early as the 1900 and then even through 1945 were Anna Julia Cooper, Fanny Barrier Williams, Ella D. Barrier, Miss Lawton, Miss Adams, and there were others that were there that were a part of the conversations from 1900 to 1945. It's very important to point out that although Marcus Garvey gets a lot of the attention, it was his 2 wives that actually had their own movements with women that were a part of these conversations that took place even in 1945. And they were very powerful women, and they managed to mobilize women's voices even when it wasn't popular to do so. I want to conclude my remarks because I know we're at the end of time, but it's also very important that we remember as well that it was in 1974 that the Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, is where women produced their own women's manifesto. As you know, that was a century also of Black Power, a time when there was major mobilization across the globe, including in the US as well as on the continent, around Black empowerment. And that was no less the case in Dar es Salaam, where of course we know the president in Tanzania had also been a part of the 1945 Congress. So it's no surprise that in 1974, when the women are there and they take their further lead into the Pan-African Congresses, that they actually designed their own manifesto. The other piece I want to point out here as well is these Pan-African Congresses and these Pan-African women's movements also were before what became the Organization of African Unity, which we now know as the African Union. If you go to Addis Ababa and you go to the headquarters of the African Union, there is a beautiful display of Pan-African women who are acknowledged for being pre-Organization of African Unity. And it all goes back to partly, in part, this legacy of the Pan-African Congresses where Pan-African women led the way. I just think it's very important. I could say more about this, but I'll put it in the chat in the next session, that we do our work, we retell our stories, we rewrite our narratives, we decolonize and depatriarch our stories. Because if we don't, who will? And I hear that from the other 2 speakers, but just as a voice of the ancestors, women, we were there and we are still here and we will be here in the future. So thank you, moderator, for allowing me to offer these comments. I only made the request simply because the other speaker wasn't here. But again, this was tracked at the conference the first day of this whole session. So we are to be inclusive. We have been inclusive, but we must be visible. We must be visible. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share a bit, just a bit of the history that we all would want to embrace.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Doc. And thank you as well to our speakers at large. Unfortunately, we have run out of time and we couldn't get to the question and answer part of the conversation, but I have been told that we will be moving to the plenary, back into the plenary, sorry. So please do make use of the link that is in the chat box so that it could take you back to the plenary session. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and thank you to our speakers. I see Reverend, I think you have.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you, and to Dr. Walker-Smith, because today is Thursdays in Black, I just wanted to also acknowledge, as she mentioned, our ancestors. They came from one of the mothers of the movement. The Black Sash movement was one of the inspirations from the ground up in South Africa, protesting against apartheid and its use of violence against Black people and Black women and women in general. So just to, again, acknowledge that we are in solidarity today and will be in the future as we remember women who suffer against the hands of all forms of gender-based violence. So thank you for everything. And thank you both for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I think we can make our way to the main session. Again, the link is in the chat box, so you could use that.
Thanks, Leisha. Thanks,
again,
thank
you so much, everyone, and very, very